Hey, what is up, everybody? Platform Disciple here with our second episode of Draw or Go. And I'm going to re explain what the goal of this series is, just so people are on the same page with me. The goal here is that I think a lot of people are very passionate about and interested in collectible card games, just like myself. But there's just so many out there, so many digital card games out there, that it's difficult to say which ones are worth playing and which ones aren't. In addition to that, there might be a lot of them that are worth playing, but we only have a limited amount of time and money to spend on those games, whether you're playing free to play or whether you're spending money or not. Point is, we have limited resources at a bare minimum because of the amount of time we have. And a lot of these games, because they are collectible card games, the more time and energy you put into these games, the better you're going to get at them, as well as the larger your collection gets. So even if there are a lot of good card games out there, you can only really devote yourself fully to so many of them because you do need to collect for these games to really participate on the highest level. So I think a lot of people need or want different things from different card games. So I'm not going to straight up tell you, oh, this game is worth your time or this one isn't, because to be honest, a lot of games are worth your time. There are a lot of really good games out there, but whether it is better for you to play one good game versus another good game is down to your preference. So what I will do is I'm going to cover what I think are some of the best aspects of that game, and then also cover the worst aspects, and leave it to your discretion to determine whether those good aspects outweigh the bad, especially when you compare them to other card games. And today we're going to be looking at Gwent, the Witcher card game. So to really understand what's good and bad about Gwent, I think it's most appropriate that we start with kind of how the game works. First of all, it is based off of a card game that is actually in the Witcher games themselves. So if you've played the Witcher series, you may have been exposed to Gwent at some level, because the card game exists in a somewhat similar form in the actual Witcher series. That being said, you don't have to have played the Witcher games or really know anything about The Witcher to enjoy Gwent. I have not played any of the Witcher games, and I'm having quite a fun time playing Gwent. I think the game is very enjoyable regardless. So right off the bat, something that makes Gwent pretty unique is it doesn't have traditional character or creature-based combat, and it doesn't have life totals. So the objective of the game is very different than the kind of objective you see in a lot of collectible card games. So how do you win? Gwent is played in 3 rounds where players try to accumulate the highest score in that round. The player who wins 2 out of the 3 rounds first wins that match. So this is done by players playing a single card at a time that will somehow impact their current score, either by directly increasing it or by impacting the cards that you will play in the future, or reducing the score of your opponent, and so on and so on. Players alternate playing one card at a time until one player chooses to pass, which is basically saying that they don't want to invest any more resources into that round. Frequently, this is done either because they are so far ahead that they believe they win the round regardless, or they simply don't want to exhaust as many resources as their opponent. One of the main strategies of Gwent is resource conservation. How do I win the round with using the fewest cards as possible, or how do I get my opponent to expend more cards than they are comfortable using? I believe that was pretty sufficient for a general overview of the game. You'll be able to see in the footage kind of how the game plays out. I don't want to go into each game mechanic in depth because I think that that'll take really too long. Gwent isn't a too complicated game. It's pretty easy to learn and pick up, but it does have enough intricacies that it's not worth me explaining. Not to mention, I'm a newer player myself, so I don't want to mislead players into thinking they're doing the right thing when in fact I could be very wrong about that. A lot of the best aspects of Gwent, of course, come from its really unique gameplay due to the fact that it has a very different strategy than most other card games, just because it completely takes out the element of character combat. If you're looking for a very fresh take on a digital card game, this is probably a good place to start. Some other advantages to playing Gwent are that it's very easy to just get into the game as a new player. I have a smaller collection. I've put little under 20 hours into the game now, which compared to a lot of other card games I've played is fairly minimal. That being said, I do feel like I am holding my own against other players, and there is a matchmaking system that matches you to players of similar level so that you aren't getting immediately trampled by players who've been playing since the beta came out. On a related note, and this can be viewed as a positive or negative, Gwent is still in beta, which means that a lot of things will change about the game and that it's still being actively developed by the company making it. There are really two big positive aspects of the game still being in beta. The first of which is that it means the game is being actively worked on and that there's a lot of future content that we can expect, new sets, new features, and balance changes that are ultimately going to make the game a better experience for everyone. The other big aspect of the game being in beta that is good for players, especially new players, is that it means the game is still young and there aren't that many cards out. You have the opportunity to jump into the game and you're not very far behind because even the most experienced players haven't played the game very long themselves, so your collection isn't dramatically smaller than even the players who've been playing since the beta just came out. Another aspect of the collecting experience for Gwent that gives new players an advantage, but also is really good for anyone playing the game at all, and this I haven't seen in any other card game, is that there's an element of choice inside opening booster packs, which is usually completely random. You do get 4 random cards, but the 5th card in your booster, you're actually displayed 3 cards which you get to select from. And what's huge about that is it means that a new player who wants to collect for a specific deck that they're working on has a little more flexibility in terms of what they're getting out of the pack, and old players who are looking to just fill out the missing cards in their collection can avoid getting these duplicates that they don't need at all anymore. Another little bit that is unique to Gwent that helps the collecting experience, but I think also just improves player feeling about the game, like a general good sentiment for the game, is that when you play against an opponent after the match, you have the opportunity to send a good game, which is like you're saying GG, but not only is that kind of just a feel-good moment, players are actually getting a small reward for that from the other player. So you're sending basically a tiny little form of currency to them, and they're sending a tiny little form of currency to you, which means that every game you play, you're building up towards being able to craft additional cards or buy more boosters. And the last thing that I want to say about the game that I think is very positive is that there's a lot of clarity in the game for anyone who's joining, which is that right-clicking on a card brings up all relevant information that you would need about it. A problem that some digital card games have is that the cards generate other cards, which is a fun gameplay mechanic, but can be confusing for newer players who don't know what the cards being generated do. But in Gwent, it's very easy to just hop into a card and see exactly what's going on with it, what cards it's going to generate, and how the game mechanics work. So now that I've finished saying everything that I think is good about Gwent, I'm going to jump into what I think is bad about the game, and there really isn't much I have to say that's bad about the game. Everything seems to be pretty good, like there's not much bad to say about it, but we're going to go into that anyways. So to start, I think that there's actually limited design space in terms of the game, in terms of game mechanics, but also just the game lore. And I could turn out to be completely wrong about this. There is the Witcher games. There's only 3 Witcher games out there, so I don't know how expansive the actual lore is and whether or not the Gwent game can really hold that many different sets for cards without there being additional Witcher games to increase the roster of characters and monsters that could exist. Like, right off the bat, we're still only in the beta of the game, but there are a lot of characters that occur many times on multiple cards, just because these characters are featured so prominently in the Witcher games, and there isn't an infinite roster of characters. Another thing that limits design space is that there's no resource system in Gwent. A card is worth one card, so to speak. So the difference in power level between cards can't be that dramatic. Like, if you look at a lot of other card games that do have a resource system, you can have crazy powerful cards that have a high cost to them. But in The Witcher, any given card can only be as powerful as another card, with the exception of, oh, this card is circumstantially more powerful than the other. Now, admittedly, I could be proved wrong about both of these things. There could be way more Witcher lore and characters that I'm unaware of, and there's also creative ways to explore the Witcher, or the Gwent game mechanics, that could result in there being a wide variety of different types of cards without introducing a resource system at all. Now, the major gripe I have with the game right now is actually a new mode that they introduced pretty recently, which is their arena mode, which is the draft mode for this game. I like drafting a lot in card games. I think it introduces a lot of interesting strategies and results in players playing decks that they might not otherwise play. But the Gwent card game has some fundamental flaws, or at least what I perceive as fundamental flaws in its draft experience. The major flaws I have with it all come down to one thing, which is that the Gwent card game is divided up into different factions, like many other card games, where when you're playing a constructed game mode like casual or ranked, your deck can include any number of cards from that particular faction in addition to a number of neutral cards. On the other side of the coin, though, the arena mode, there aren't deck building rules, which means that you're getting cards from across a wide variety of factions, really actually all the factions, and there's no limit on the number of gold, silver, or bronze cards that you can have, as far as I know. What makes this such a big problem is it means that there aren't real game mechanics that you can play around. One of the big aspects of the Gwent card game that I have noticed in playing Constructed is that your opponent has a limited number of gold cards, they have a limited number of silver cards, and that you have a general understanding of what cards you need to play around from that faction, because there are certain strategies related to each faction and certain synergies that you can expect coming from each. Now, the trouble with the arena mode is there's nothing to play around because you don't really know what is in your opponent's deck at all. It's a total crapshoot. And in addition, when you're creating your deck by picking the cards that are displayed to you, filling up your deck, there isn't a cohesive strategy that you can build around really ever. One of the fun elements for me for drafting in other card games is that you try to find synergies within your card pool that really make the deck kind of cohesive, even though it might be a powered down version of other decks you might play in Constructed, there are still synergies in your deck. Now, because you're getting cards across all the factions, it's very difficult to build any kind of synergies, because if a card comes up that specifies that you need dwarfs, who knows how many dwarfs you have. I mean, you can check and you can try to draft around dwarfs, but it's really hard to justify picking synergy cards when you don't know what other cards are going to be displayed to you later in the drafting period. So this results in a problem, which is that you ultimately kind of have to just pick the best standalone cards most of the time when you pick a card, because you can't ever rely on seeing a certain type of synergistic card, because you're getting just a total crapshoot of different stuff. What I think is really the nail in the coffin for what I'm describing as problems in the arena experience is when you are playing Gwent, you have a leader card, which you begin with in, I guess, what you would call the leader zone at the start of the game. This is a card that is 100% reliable for you because you know you're going to have it. And in Constructed, this frequently means that you can pick a leader card that caters to the synergies of your deck. You can even build a deck around your leader's effects. That being said, it's baffling to me that in the drafting experience, the last card you pick in your deck is your leader, a card that is debatably one of the most important cards in your entire deck and in its strategy. Now, it's possible that some of you who have played Gwent might think to yourselves, well, I actually really like the arena mode. And that's all right. I think it's still fun. The game is still fun. But I think compared to what the arena mode could be, it's just so weak that when you compare it to other drafting experiences in other card games, it's really inherently inferior. But I have a lot of hope for it because the game is still in beta and the design team is taking feedback from people. So what I'm hoping is that the arena experience will get better and will be changed to be more positive. And what I predict will happen, because I think that the design team is going to be pretty responsive on this, is that you will have most of your cards come from one faction and the neutral cards, and that you will pick your leader first. Just those changes alone would make my opinion of the arena experience dramatically better. So just to reiterate, because I think it was kind of clear, but I did want to make it very explicit, is that if you picked your leader first and then most of your cards, or at least like half of them, came from that leader's faction, you could make the draft experience a lot more strategic, because rather than picking the best standalone card, you could try to cater towards the synergies that are in that faction or specific to that leader. I think that would be a much more positive experience and could also result in more interesting gameplay, because you know what's in your deck, you know kind of like what strategy you're playing, and also you could take a look at your opponent's leader and have some expectations for what cards you might expect to see from them. Last little side note here is that I think there are just a couple things that could be quality of life changes for the game. Like when you're opening booster packs, I mentioned earlier that you can right click on a card to see the kind of in-depth details, what cards it generates, if it generates other cards. You actually can't do that in the booster pack opening experience, which is very relevant during the period where you get to pick one of 3 cards, because sometimes you're just like, well, depending on what kind of card this is spawning, and this is coming from the perspective of a new player who doesn't know all the cards, depending on what the card is spawning, that really dramatically changes which cards you want, because if you don't know what card it's generating, it's harder to justify picking that card, or you might pick that card and end up disappointed. Either way, that's a bad experience, and I actually think that that's probably something that they will change. I don't think that would be particularly hard to implement, and it's something that also doesn't detract from the game that much. It's just something that I would like to see changed. So that's pretty much all I have to say about Gwent for today. Overall, really great game. I do think it is worth checking out. Of course, you can factor in your own preferences as to what you think of my opinions, and your own opinions, of course, are just as valid. And yeah, so next time I'm going to take a look at a different card game. If you guys have suggestions, of course, leave it in the comments below. There are a few I have in mind already that I've put some time into that I think are worth talking about. And yeah, until next time, it's been good. See you later.